Hello everyone, and welcome to the official Bull Moose Party YouTube channel. And today we are going to be ranking the presidents of the United States. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with us here at the Bull Moose Party, we are essentially a third party that is trying to break the chains of a two-party system and bring about better representation of the American people through all these different reforms that we have planned. And we are essentially, a better way to explain it, are the revived version of Theodore Roosevelt's 1912 Progressive Party that he formed as a way to break the two-party system. Of course, this effort failed, but we are going to try again to break the two-party system. Though, admittedly, at this time, again, we were very young, and hopefully we have a lot more room to grow. But anyways, I have actually not put out any policy announcements for the Bull Moose Party. And so I thought today would be kind of a great day to kind of show you guys a lot of the things that we stand for here at the Bull Moose Party by ranking the presidents of the United States. By ranking these presidents, I can essentially show you which presidents we would like to emulate, which presidents we would not like to emulate, which certain policies we'd like to copy from other presidents, and which policies we do not support from these certain presidents and all these different administrations. So without further ado, let's rank the presidents of the United States of America. Starting out, of course, with George Washington. Now, George Washington is essentially the quintessential American presidency. He started kind of the two-term thing. He started the inaugural address. He started the farewell address. All these kind of traditions that we hold for a president to have really started with George Washington. Our very idea of an American president started with George Washington. So, there's not much negative you can say about it. I like to have contrarian opinions, but I have to agree with everyone else and just say George Washington had a perfect presidency. Again, there's not any negatives that come to mind. One big legacy of George Washington's presidency, despite all the other things that he did that had a huge, tremendous effect on our nation, is his foreign policy. I'm going to be talking about foreign policy a lot today in this video because that's actually probably the subject I am most familiar about when talking about presidential administrations. George Washington, of course, in his farewell address, quite famously endorsed isolationism. And again, this defined American foreign policy all the way up until maybe McKinley, or some might say Wilson or Franklin Delano Roosevelt. It really just depends on who you ask, really. But George Washington really started America's move towards isolationism. And while that might sound bad today, during America's early years, isolation was necessary for survival. America could not really get involved in all these wars that were going on in Europe and hope to survive. I highly doubt America would be able to survive if it, again, got involved in all these wars in Europe. They were just too weak during this time frame, too young to, survive that. So I completely understand George Washington's policy, and overall I think it's a positive for America during her first 100 years or so. I believe this was 100% necessary, really. So, unsurprisingly, George Washington's going to be going in the S tier. Again, just the quintessential perfect presidency. I already said this before, but it's a very important point. When we think of the President of the United States, our thoughts on that all stem all the way back to George Washington. Okay, so the next person we have is John Adams, and he certainly had a much more flawed presidency compared to that of George Washington. So, John Adams, he had probably a huge positive and in the fact that he kept us out of war with France. So, I already mentioned before George Washington's policy of isolationism. Well, France actually wanted to kick us out of isolation and help them during the French Revolutionary Wars. After all, the French did help America during its war for independence. So that France thought that America should return the favor. However, George Washington and his successor, John Adams, did not want to, again, get America involved in this foreign war all the way over in Europe and possibly risk stability domestically. So, because the French were not very happy, and a lot of issues ensued with them, specifically the XYZ affair, where the French heavily disrespected American diplomats. Then later on, French ships started attacking American ships, and vice versa. And so it turned into what they term a quasi-war, in which there was no official declaration of war, but American ships and French ships were attacking each other. The party that John Adams was with wanted war with France. They were very much an anti-French party compared to their opponents. But John Adams, despite his party wanting to go to war with France, actually had restraint and kept us out of war with France. Any other one of these presidents, or a lot of these other presidents on this list, would have probably gone to war with France. But he kept us cool and kept us out of a foreign war that would heavily risk American stability. So for that, he baseline gets a C tier. Then, though, there is the big negative of John Adams' presidency, of course, and that is the Alien and Sedition Acts. This is the most infamous aspect of John Adams' presidency, and for good reason. The Alien and Sedition Acts pretty much censored free speech in the American press, which today we see that as very unconstitutional, and during that time frame, I believe most people did see it that way. But John Adams wanted to censor a lot of these attacks on him from the newspaper that he did not particularly like. And this was a huge negative and really tarnished John Adams's presidency and his legacy overall. Because free speech is one of the most important ideals of America. And the fact that John Adams kind of tried to censor that is, it makes us very uneasy. And because of that, I'm going to have to put John Adams in the C tier. Great foreign policy with France. He kept us out of a war, but he also censored free speech in America, which was not a very good thing. Okay, next we have Thomas Jefferson. Now, Thomas Jefferson was better than John Adams, and I have no real negatives to say about it. I don't think he was an amazing president, like A tier, but I don't think he was that horrible either. No, he was above not that horrible. He was pretty good overall. He was a solid president, so I'm going to put him in the B tier. Of course, his most famous accomplishment during his presidency was the Louisiana Purchase, which he bought land from Napoleon that greatly expanded American territory out west. So that's a huge thing. The Louisiana Purchase is very, very important to American history, and so much of American history would not happen if the Louisiana Purchase did not happen. So just from that, Thomas Jefferson's already one of the most influential presidents of all time, just from that. But aside from that, though, I cannot really think of any massive major achievements. One thing I like about Thomas Jefferson's presidency was the fact that he did not continue the Alien Sedition Acts that John Adams started. Thomas Jefferson was part of the opposing political party to John Adams, and he could have done what John Adams did to Democratic Republican newspapers and tried to kind of censor that. But Thomas Jefferson did not do that to his opponents. I don't know if he repealed it, but he didn't enforce the Alien Sedition Acts, at least. And that's one positive I like about Thomas Jefferson's presidency. He did not kind of play the same game that John Adams was playing and continued the Alien Sedition Acts. So for that, I like Thomas Jefferson for. But he did have kind of sort of negatives when it came to his foreign policy. Of course, one would say he had a great foreign policy achievement with Louisiana Purchase. But one thing he was also trying to do was secure American trade, I believe, between England and France. So during this time frame that Thomas Jefferson was president, we had the Napoleonic Wars, which the main people fighting against each other was England and France. And I believe Thomas Jefferson was trying to achieve essentially American neutrality in trade and everything like that. But these efforts were largely futile. He tried to impose embargoes to try to make people respect American shipping in that region. But it ended up hurting Americans more than actually hurt France and England. And yeah, so that wasn't a particularly successful part of Thomas Jefferson's presidency. But aside from that, overall, Thomas Jefferson was a solid president. Nothing particularly negative to say about his presidency. But I don't think he's just, A-tier president kind of thing. So I think Thomas Jefferson's comfortably in the B tier. Now, his successor, James Madison, I actually kind of like better than Thomas Jefferson. He, of course, was president during the War of 1812. Now, a lot of people could ding James Madison for getting America involved in the War of 1812. But I personally think Madison was kind of right in getting us in the War of 1812. He supported going to war with the British over impressment of American soldiers, where the British would come to American ships and force American sailors to join the British Navy. But the thing that really, I think, justifies the War of 1812 is the fact that the British were selling arms and equipment and essentially funding these Native American tribes, I believe in the Midwest, to attack American citizens. Now this, I just feel like, was complete justification for any war in 1812. I personally think that alone, just the fact that the British would fund these Native Americans to attack American citizens, just, I don't know. I feel like it was pretty justifiable for James Madison to want to declare war on Britain. Maybe I'm just biased, though, because I am a huge fan of a certain politician I'm going to be talking a lot today. He was never president, but he's my favorite politician. That is, of course, Henry Clay. Henry Clay was what they call a war hawk, in which he strongly advocated for a war with Great Britain in 1812. So maybe I'm a little biased in that regard because, again, I'm a huge Henry Clay fan. Maybe I am. But I sincerely believe we were justified in having the War of 1812 happen. Now, after the War of 1812 was declared, things didn't go too well for America. Of course, our capital actually got burned by the British, and the White House was actually burned down during the War of 1812. But I believe James Madison delivered a strong, steady leadership throughout the War of 1812. And at the end of the war, America, honestly, had more prestige than when it started out with. By the end of the war, it showed that they could hold their own against the British. Sure, it wasn't this great achievement. A lot of people were hoping that they could take Canada during the War of 1812. That didn't happen. So, overall, I believe James Madison delivered strong leadership throughout the War of 1812, even when things were going bad, like when the Capitol was burning. And overall, I have a very positive opinion of James Madison. He actually paved the way for the era of good feelings, where there actually was not a lot of political discord within America. So that's a big positive of James Madison's presidency. So overall, I'm going to put James Madison in the B tier, but actually very, very high B for me. I really like James Madison. I believe he did give indispensable leadership. I believe that's the correct term. He gave strong leadership during the War of 1812, and I do kind of support his decision to get involved in that conflict. Okay, next we have one of my all-time personal favorite presidents, And that, of course, is James Monroe. He led America during this time of the era of good feelings, in which, again, there's not a lot of political discord or disagreements. There was one disagreement that happened, really, that almost shook the country. That was in 1820, when they were trying to figure out what to do with all these new states as they were expanding west. So that caused a lot of debate, but that was eventually solved thanks to the great compromiser, again, Henry Clay. He heavily supported the Compromise of 1820, which kind of kept America from getting really divided over the slavery issue. Anyway, so James Monroe was president during the era of good feelings and just brought about a time of great stability. There was an economic panic, I believe, that happened in 1819. But aside from that, there's really nothing negative you can say about James Monroe, his presidency. Again, it was stable. It was just a really nice time. There's, again, very little political discord. The only thing that happened was really in 1820. So, overall, I'm a big fan of James Monroe. Next, however, we have a president I'm not quite as fond of as I am of James Monroe. That is John Quincy Adams. And while I'm on the topic of John Quincy Adams, I forgot to talk about two very important things about James Monroe. I, of course, would love to talk about the Monroe Doctrine. James Monroe started the Monroe Doctrine, which essentially said that Europe will not get involved in the affairs of independent countries within the Western Hemisphere. He started the Monroe Doctrine, and it's been a mainstay of American foreign policy throughout, or in all of America's history after James Monroe's presidency. It's a very important foreign policy, and that's obviously a huge positive to James Monroe. The other positive to James Monroe's presidency is, that's why I was reminded of that when I was talking about John Quincy Adams, he actually acquired Florida during this presidency. James Monroe had a brilliant Secretary of State. That was eventually the next president, John Quincy Adams. And Adams was actually able to negotiate us getting Florida in the Adams-Honest Treaty. So that was a very, very, very important thing. We got Florida. I know some people would say that's actually negative, but anyways, I'm sorry about that. But he got us Florida, which honestly was very, very important. Florida is a very important state in American history. And that was honestly thanks to the efforts of brilliant Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, as well as the recklessness of the president after John Quincy Adams, Andrew Jackson. But yeah, I forgot to talk about those two major foreign policy achievements. Us getting Florida and also the Monroe Doctrine. But anyways, next we have John Quincy Adams. Now, John Quincy Adams was a fantastic diplomat, Secretary of State, all of that. He was also there during the Treaty of Ghent, in which we had peace, or had the peace that ended the War of 1812. John Quincy Adams was there, along with Henry Clay. But overall, in the presidency of John Quincy Adams, there's not really too much to talk about. He was an okay president. I'm going to put him in the C tier. He wasn't particularly bad or anything, just wasn't exceptionally good either. His presidency really was marred by these accusations of a corrupt scandal going on. So in the election that John Quincy Adams ran in, that was the 1824 election, there was actually no party due to the era of good feelings. Everyone was part of the same political party. But there was 4 candidates for president. That's going to be Henry Clay, one of my all-time favorite politicians, John Quincy Adams, the Treasury Secretary under Monroe. He was actually a very good Treasury Secretary, I believe. He came from Georgia. His name was Crawford, I believe is the correct name. And then, of course, we have Andrew Jackson. Well, Crawford, Quincy Adams, and Andrew Jackson won a majority of won the most electoral votes, while Henry Clay won the least. But none of the candidates won an outright majority in the Electoral College, which meant the election had to go to the House. Whichever candidate had the most House votes would win the presidency. So here's the interesting tidbit, though. While Henry Clay could not become president, since he was kind of ruled out and only the top three were put up for choosing, he was Speaker of the House, or essentially the person who controlled the majority of House members. And because of that, he pretty much was able to decide who became president. So a lot of people, particularly Jackson supporters, said that John Quincy Adams made a deal with Henry Clay, in which Henry Clay would deliver Adams the majority in the House, and then Adams would make Henry Clay Secretary of State, which during that time was essentially the successor to become the next president, the Secretary of State. So a lot of people claimed that happened, and that's how John Quincy Adams became president. As a Henry Clay fan, I'm a little biased, but I personally think there was no corrupt bargain. I think you could pretty much tell Henry Clay was never going to let Andrew Jackson, who was really the only real contender for the presidency, with John Quincy Adams. Crawford was kind of much more smaller, had much smaller appeal. The top two candidates were Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. And I can pretty much sure Clay would have never chosen Jackson under any circumstances. Thomas Jefferson did not want Andrew Jackson as president. And Henry Clay was a big fan of Thomas Jefferson. And he, probably like Jefferson, did not want Andrew Jackson as president. Again, I may be a little biased. Maybe there was a corrupt bargain. I'm just completely wrong. Because Henry Clay was made as Quincy Adams' Secretary of State, for sure. So maybe there was a bargain, but still, I believe Henry Clay would have supported Adams no matter what. Okay, next, now we have Andrew Jackson. And so, you've heard me talk a lot about Henry Clay. I'm a big Henry Clay fan. And essentially, the anathema of Henry Clay was Andrew Jackson. On Andrew Jackson's deathbed, he sincerely wished that his vice president, I believe actually during Jackson's first term, John C. Calhoun, and Henry Clay, I lost my train of thought. On his deathbed, he wished that John C. Calhoun, who I already explained about, and Henry Clay were, I think one of them, he wanted hung and the other one shot. So, as a Henry Clay fan, I do not like Andrew Jackson. I do not. Aside from him having a strong dislike of Clay, Andrew Jackson ended the National Bank, which sowed the seeds for economic turmoil in the future. And also, of course, the Indian Removal Act, where he kicked Native Americans from their land, moved them out to, I believe, Oklahoma. That was a huge negative of Andrew Jackson's presidency. And again, him getting rid of the National Bank was just sheer stupidity on Andrew Jackson's part. Thomas Jefferson, who did not like the National Bank, still thought the National Bank was helpful enough that he kept it around. Again, even though he didn't really like it, Jefferson was not a big fan of the federal government having too much power. He believed the National Bank was too much power for the government to have, really, or the federal government to have. He wanted that to be kind of, I believe, more delegated to the states. But still, Thomas Jefferson saw how great the National Bank was and kept it. Jackson decided to get rid of it. And again, it sowed the seeds for economic turmoil later on during the presidency of his successor, Martin Van Buren. For me, that's a huge negative. And again, I'm a little biased because I'm a big Henry Clay fan. Not a big Jackson fan. I do not like Jackson much at all, personally. But he does have one big positive that puts him in the C tier. And that is the fact that he really expanded the people's right to vote. I believe before Andrew Jackson, it was more of landowners and stuff like that that were able to vote. But Jackson, I believe, really expanded voting rights to the average person. He was, I believe, a lot of people called the people's president. The people loved Andrew Jackson. And he greatly expanded voting rights, which was, honestly, it is, despite me not liking Andrew Jackson, that was a big positive. And so, again, despite my own personal dislike for him, that puts him in the C tier. Okay, Martin Van Buren does not have the luxury, old Matty Van, he does not have the luxury of having greatly expanded voting rights like Andrew Jackson. So he doesn't have that big positive to help him out. So he's going to be in the, not the C tier, the D tier. So, I was talking about Andrew Jackson getting rid of the National Bank. Well, inevitably, that caused a great economic decline during the presidency of Andrew Jackson's successor, Martin Van Buren. And, this caused a lot of economic trouble. And pretty much Martin Van Buren's whole presidency was spent trying to deal with that. Not very successfully, though he did admittedly do some policies that were helpful. But at the end of the day, a lot of this was ineffective. Because, again, the reason this happened, I believe, was because they got rid of the National Bank. And Martin Van Buren did not bring back the National Bank. He kind of did sort of half measures. They were positive steps, but he didn't solve the root of the problem. So I'm going to put Martin Van Buren in the D tier. Because he doesn't have the advantage of Andrew Jackson, and he shared many of the policies of Andrew Jackson. Martin Van Buren, actually was president during the majority of when the Indian Removal Act happened, I believe. But I'm not a huge Martin Van Buren fan. Personally, on a personal level, I like him better than Jackson. But just purely looking at their presidencies and their achievements, Martin Van Buren is going to be in the D tier. Okay, the next president is William Henry Harrison. And unfortunately, he was only president for 30 days before he died in office. And I feel like this is a great travesty. So, to kind of explain myself, William Henry Harrison was a member of the Whig Party. That was a party founded by Henry Clay. That was essentially the opposition party to Andrew Jackson. And William Henry Harrison, I sincerely believe, would have been a fantastic president. He gave the longest inaugural address in American history. And if you actually listen to it, I believe on YouTube, you can listen to like an audio version of William Henry Harrison's inaugural address. The speech is amazing. And a lot of the policies he talked about sounded amazing. He was more kind of like Coolidge. We'll talk about him later. And the fact that he wanted a weaker executive branch. He wanted more power to Congress. And I sincerely support that. I'm a big fan of I feel like the executive power, starting out actually with Jackson really started the ever-increasing strength of the executive branch. And William Henry Harrison had this principled thing with the executive branch, at least when you hear his speech, which he wanted to not let the executive branch be just so powerful. Of course, executive power would increase greatly over the centuries. But I strongly support a lot of what William Henry Harrison said in that speech. And it was a fantastic speech, in my personal opinion. If you listen to it, it's pretty good. But unfortunately, he wasn't able to implement a lot of those policies, which included bringing back the National Bank. But he died, unfortunately. And we got stuck with his vice president, who we're going to be talking about now, the false Whig, John Tyler. Now, John Tyler had a big opportunity to bring back the National Bank and do all these Whig policies that the Whigs supported, like Henry Clay. But John Tyler was pretty much an anti-Jackson Democrat, if you will. And he did not support the National Bank. So we did not get that. So I personally heavily dislike him. He was actually disowned by the Whig Party and became a politically homeless president who was disliked by the Whigs, and I don't think that very well loved by the Democrats either. So big negative for me was him getting rid of not bringing back National Bank. And then adding to that, his presidency was just very ineffectual. No one really liked him. He wasn't really able to get much done in his presidency. The one big thing was near the end, he actually was the president who admitted Texas to the Union. So that's a big thing. But I don't feel like it's enough to save him from the D tier. He was, honestly, I may be being a little overdramatic. He was not terrible, but I still think D tier is a very comfortable spot to put him. He didn't bring back the National Bank, and he wasn't really able to do much effectual stuff because all the parties hated him pretty much. So I'm going to put John Tyler in the D tier. Okay, so the next president you probably think I strongly dislike because he is a strong supporter of Jackson. That's James Polk. In fact, Jackson was called Old Hickory. James K. Polk was called Young Hickory. So it seemed like someone I'm not going to like. But especially since, actually, James K. Polk, when he ran for president, ran against Henry Clay and beat Henry Clay. So you would think, I do not like James K. Polk. But I do actually like James K. Polk a lot. He's actually my personal favorite president of the United States, which may come as a shock since I love Henry Clay so much, and my favorite political party in American history is the Whig Party. But I, in fact, am a huge fan of James K. Polk. Now, why am I a big fan of James K. Polk? The reason I love James K. Polk is because largely of his work ethic. You see, he started out his presidency with 3 main goals. I can't remember one of them, but I remember the other 2. That is to deal with the Texas issue. Mexico did not accept Texan independence, and there's still a lot of contested territory going on. And additionally, solving out a border dispute with England over Oregon. We didn't really know at the time the border between what was British colonial area, mainly Canada, and what was American territory in Oregon. And I believe there was another thing he wanted to deal with. I can't remember what it was. But he essentially was able to accomplish, he only served 1 term as president. He was able to accomplish every single goal he set out for at the start of his presidency. Which is crazy. He had a fantastic work ethic. Some would say he actually worked himself to death. I believe just about 3 months after he left the presidency, he died. Just from all that stress he induced himself in. He worked so hard as president. Staying up late into the night. I really greatly admire that. His work ethic. Even if you don't agree with what James K. Polk did, he worked terribly hard to get all his goals accomplished in 1 term as president. Then, to boot with that, he actually gave us California, Arizona, and New Mexico, and more land in Texas. So Thomas Jefferson greatly expanded American territory with the Louisiana Purchase. James Madison got us Florida, and pretty much James K. Polk got the rest except for Hawaii and Alaska. So that's a landmark presence. He greatly expanded American territory. The one negative I do hear people talk about, though, is the Mexican-American War. A lot of people feel like James K. Polk behaved in the manner of a warmonger, and that he sent troops into contested territory. Mexico, of course, responded and started the Mexican-American War. A lot of people blame that war for starting on James K. Polk, and I can certainly see arguments for that, but I feel like the war would have happened either way. I've read somewhere, I believe it was a National Park website, that Mexico saw the annexation of Texas by the United States as an act of war. I believe war was inevitable at that point, and I don't believe that James K. Polk was intentionally provoking a war with Mexico. He sent troops down in kind of that contested territory, I believe, as a show of diplomatic strength, to kind of show Mexico that this is our territory, we have troops here. But it was, again, more of a diplomatic play. I believe negotiations were happening during that time. It was a diplomatic play. But Mexico responded by attacking the American troops, which, again, some would say he caused that to happen. Others would say he wouldn't. I personally don't believe James K. Polk was trying to cause the war to happen. I believe, again, it was just a diplomatic show of strength by sending troops in that area. He did not mean to invade that area or anything. Again, it's just a diplomatic show of, we're stronger than you, so in these negotiations, you better give us that land, if you will. So again, you can easily interpret that as James K. Polk wanting to go to war. But again, I believe he did not really want the war to happen. It just ended up happening. But anyways, I digress. James K. Polk, I really like him. He's not the best president we've ever had, but he's my favorite one. Again, just from his work ethic and the fact that he was able to get every single goal he had done. Say what you will about those goals, but he was able to accomplish every single one. Anyways, next we have President Zachary Taylor. Now, Zachary Taylor, despite being a Whig, I'm not as huge a fan of. He was not part of the traditional Clay wing of the Whig Party. He was more of the Southern Whigs. And, yeah, Zachary Taylor, I'm not the biggest fan of, but he was okay. I'm going to put him in the C tier. He actually died in his presidency, just like William Henry Harrison, though he lasted, I believe, about a year or 2 years into his presidency. I'm not a huge Zachary Taylor fan. There was not too much he accomplished within his presidency, I don't believe. So, yeah, he's just, he's okay. I don't have anything ferociously negative to say about him. So, yeah, I'm going to put Zachary Taylor in the C tier. I actually like him better as a general than I do a president, personally. But anyways, his vice president, who became president after Zachary Taylor died, Millard Fillmore, I actually like a bit better. I'm actually going to put Millard Fillmore in the B tier. Now, why do I like Millard Fillmore? Millard Fillmore was more of your traditional Clay version of the Whig Party. He was really the only traditional Whig we ever really had as President of the United States. And so he advocated for a lot of things that I really like about the Whig Party. I believe he strongly advocated for internal improvements, which we here at the Bold Moose Party are big supporters of. I love internal improvements. That was a big thing that Henry Clay wanted, and I love that. So, yeah. There are flaws to not Zachary Taylor. Millard Fillmore, though. He was pretty much too compromising. My favorite politician is Henry Clay, who's known as the Great Compromiser. But Millard Fillmore compromised to a fault. You see, Henry Clay, while he was willing to compromise on issues, still had this strong ideological thing, specifically with like the National Bank and things like that. Millard Fillmore, on the other hand, was pretty much willing to compromise on any issue, period. I believe that was sort of a flaw with him, especially later on during the Civil War. He just he compromised to a point where you had to take a strong stance on an issue, but he still wanted to compromise, even in situations, again, where a strong stance was necessary. So that's kind of my complaint with Millard Fillmore, but one thing I actually do like that he passed, which a lot of people dislike, was the Compromise of 1850. I know a lot of people hate the Compromise of 1850, and it included some very, very bad things. Don't get me wrong, it included some bad things, like the Fugitive Slave Act, which actually would encourage Southern slave owners, to come up into free states and get their runaway slaves back who thought they were safe in a free state. But the system made by the Fugitive Slave Act made it so that slave owners could also get people who were legally free and bring them back to the South, even though those slave owners never actually owned them in the first place. It kind of invited that corruption to happen. So that was, I'm not saying the Compromise of 1850 was perfect, because it was not. It had some big negatives attached to it. But here's the thing about the Compromise of 1850. It kept us out of civil war. A lot of historians believe that America was not strong enough to survive a civil war that happened in 1850. And that the Compromise of 1850 essentially bought time for America to become stronger, to respond more effectively to the Civil War during the presidency of Abraham Lincoln. I personally believe that if Abraham Lincoln was president during the time of Millard Fillmore, he would also endorse the Compromise of 1850. So I personally am a supporter of the Compromise of 1850, not because I like the provisions in there, but it did keep us out of civil war and allowed America to become stronger so they could respond in the most effective manner to secession. So anyways, yeah, I'm going to put Millard Fillmore in the B tier. He advocated for traditional Whig principles, which I liked, and of course, and the Compromise of 1850, which again, I get why a lot of people think is negative, because the act had a lot of negatives, but it also, again, kept us out of Civil War, and allowed America to become stronger to respond more effectively to Southern secession in 1861, I believe, or 1860 is when they kind of started it. Very late 1860. But anyways, I digress. So the next president we have, Franklin Pierce, will actually be our first F-tier president. I'm actually really fast going to get rid of the E tier. I do not like the E tier. I feel like it's strange. I'm used to S, A, B, C, D, F. Anyways, Franklin Pierce is going to be our first F tier and president. The reason I put him in the F tier is because he was not a very strong president. His own party didn't really like him that much. Essentially what happened was he was elected president, and then a very tragic accident happened involving his son. And I believe after that, he just drank all the time. And so, yeah, his presidency was just marred by that, and it wasn't really able to accomplish any major things. He was just kind of a not-so-good president. And then the next president after Franklin Pierce is going to be James Buchanan. Now, I do not like James Buchanan one bit. I believe most people do not like James Buchanan one bit. Thing I don't like about James Buchanan is he was perfectly okay with the Southern states seceding. So after Lincoln won the presidency in 1860, James Buchanan was in his lame duck era, if you will, in which he couldn't really do much of anything. Or no, he was just waiting for Abraham Lincoln to become president. So a lot of Southern states weren't happy with Abraham Lincoln becoming president, and they were trying to secede from the Union. Instead of offering a strong response to them doing that, James Buchanan was pretty much like, yeah, do whatever you want, I don't care. He wasn't like that, but that's kind of the sense you got from it. He was not willing to respond strongly to what was happening in the Civil War. Or not in the Civil War, but in the secession crisis. He was not willing to give a strong, no, you can't secede. And he was pretty much just like, yeah, you legally have a right to, I believe, so bye. He was not a good president. Aside from that, though, I don't believe he was very popular and just a very president. Aside from that, but then just add that to the way he was responding to the secession crisis, he's got to be in the F tier. Abraham Lincoln. Now, Abraham Lincoln, of course, is one of the most beloved presidents of all time. I'm going to put him, of course, in the A tier. Now, a lot of people put him in the S tier, and the reason I didn't put him in the S tier was because he did shut down newspapers that were not particularly supportive of Abraham Lincoln's Civil War efforts. So I'm not a big fan of that, the fact that he would jail political dissenters and suspend habeas corpus and all of that. I'm not a big fan of that. So that's the thing that keeps him from coming all the way up to the S tier, but he's definitely high A. Let's talk about the many positives of Abraham Lincoln's presidency. He led us through probably one of the most tumultuous and darkest hours of America's history, kept us together, supported. He could have taken the easy way out and just been like, okay, I don't want a war. South can secede and do whatever they want, especially after all the setbacks he experienced early on in the Civil War. But Abraham Lincoln kept going. Then he freed all the slaves in the South and in the border states. I believe he eventually got to the border states after the Emancipation Proclamation. Definitely, he started the freeing of all the slaves in the South, and also, I believe, on the border states. And he is a landmark president for that reason. Again, he kept us together during one of America's darkest, most tumultuous times, and he did the Emancipation Proclamation and all of that freed all the slaves, which is huge. Just, you can't understate how important Abraham Lincoln was and how defining his presidency was. So he, of course, has to be in the A tier. Another kind of negative I do have to say about Abraham Lincoln is his choice in generals, especially early on. I don't believe he had that particularly good choice in the generals to put at the top command of the Northern troops. So, yeah. Anyways, I'm going to put Abraham Lincoln in A tier, just from all those positives that I mentioned. And the thing that keeps him from S are those two negatives. His choice in generals, I don't believe, early on was very good. Eventually he got Grant, which Grant was fantastic general, so. But, yeah. Okay, next we have Andrew Johnson. So I'm a little more sympathetic to Andrew Johnson than I believe a lot of people are. A lot of people just love to bash Andrew Johnson. I completely understand. He had a very hard situation to get through. And that was the fact that Congress was controlled by people who hated Andrew Johnson's guts. He was kicked from the presidency. He was impeached and almost kicked from the presidency on some dumb rule, essentially. And yeah, I got off track, but yeah. Congress tended to kick him from the presidency over some minor rule, and that just shows how much they disliked Andrew Johnson. So he couldn't really do too much and be very effective. But his Reconstruction policies, honestly, overall, were not very successful and not very good. But I do hold a little bit of sympathy for him, because he really genuinely, I believe, was trying to unite the country after the craziness of the Civil War. But I don't think he was very effective. His Reconstruction policies were not very good. But I understand Congress was probably a pain to deal with during this time frame because they hated each other. And then Andrew Johnson, his policies that did enact were not very successful. I believe Johnson kind of suffered from the similar thing as Millard Fillmore, in that he was too compromising to a fault where he should have taken a strong stance. And I think that's a really great way to describe Andrew Johnson's Reconstruction policies. But anyways, yeah, I'm overall going to put him in the D tier. I think very, very low D, but still D tier for me. I don't think he's as unlikable or as bad as these two right here. James Buchanan and Franklin Pierce. But he still was not very good. Let's keep that perfectly in mind. Okay, next we have Ulysses S. Grant. And while Ulysses S. Grant was a great general, I don't personally actually like his presidency too much. There was a lot of corruption going on, which obviously not very good. And I feel like Ulysses S. Grant, like Johnson, had very poor Reconstruction era policies. His one very great one was his attack on the KKK. He pretty much reduced that to almost nothing during his presidency, which was a great positive. But I feel like aside from that, his Reconstruction policies were not very successful and didn't really work. So I'm going to put him in the C tier. He was a solid president, did some good things, but again, I feel like his Reconstruction policies were not as effective as they could have been, if you know what I'm talking about. So yeah, that's kind of my thoughts on Ulysses S. Grant. I'm not massively knowledgeable about his presidency, so I could be wrong. Actually, one big thing about Ulysses S. Grant's presidency is everyone gives Theodore Roosevelt the credit for all the national parks. That was actually started, technically speaking, by Ulysses S. Grant. He founded Yellowstone National Park. then Theodore Roosevelt later on greatly expanded the park system into what we know today. So yeah, Ulysses Grant, he has some positives to his presidency, but I don't think he was particularly fantastic at his job as president of the United States. So the next one we have is Rutherford B. Hayes, otherwise known as Rutherford B. Hayes. So, Rutherford B. Hayes is kind of one of those presidents that you don't really know much about their actual presidency. I don't believe he was a very great president during his presidency, but the thing that really marred his reputation, I believe, was how he got the presidency. So during this time, America is deeply, deeply divided, and we have an election in where both candidates, Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel Tilden, contested certain electoral votes. Depending on where those electoral votes went in these certain southern states, that would decide the entire election. And Rutherford B. Hayes essentially made a deal with the southern politicians in those southern states that if they gave him the electoral votes, he would end Reconstruction or something like that. It was very corrupt. And I feel like that really marred Rutherford B. Hayes' legacy. And I believe America was not really ready to end their Reconstruction policies. And yeah, he just ended it to become president. And I don't know. That really hurts his reputation for me. But overall, I'm going to put him in the D tier. I think aside from that, during his actual presidency, he wasn't too terrible. He would have been a C tier, though, if it wasn't for this corrupt deal that happened, I feel like. Anyways, next we have President James Garfield. So, like William Henry Harrison, unfortunately, he died like 40 days into office, shot by Charles Guiteau, who's upset because he was not given a cabinet position or a certain position by James Garfield when he was elected president. Anyways, so James Garfield, he was like William Henry Harrison, in which I wish he was president. One of the most intelligent men to ever hold the presidency, and he was shot 40 days into office. This guy was a genius, I'm telling you. And I really think he could have actually really united the country during this Reconstruction, in the aftermath of the Reconstruction era. I sincerely believe he would have been a landmark president. But unfortunately, he died. So, yeah, instead we had his vice president, Chester Arthur. Now, Chester Arthur, I'm going to put in the C tier. Had some positives and had some negatives. His big positive was the fact that he stopped the spoils system, started by none other than Andrew Jackson. But he ended the spoils system and all these certain corruption things. Arthur was a very anti-corruption president. And yeah, the big negative people talk about with Chester Arthur, though, was the Chinese Exclusion Act, which in many ways was sort of a racist legislation against allowing Chinese to immigrate to the United States. Which, yeah, that was not too good. So yeah, I'm going to put Chester A. Arthur in the C tier. Next we have Grover Cleveland. And I'm actually going to put Grover Cleveland also in the C tier. He also did a lot, Cleveland did, to fight corruption in government. And his presidency certainly wasn't bad, but it wasn't particularly good either. Grover Cleveland is especially known because he was actually the first president to have 2 non-consecutive terms, the second one being Donald Trump in the present day. But Grover Cleveland, I don't feel like had very much of a landmark presidency. And his second non-consecutive term was completely ruined by this huge financial depression called the Panic of 1893. That pretty much, the Panic of 1893 was essentially America's Great Depression before the Great Depression happened. It was a big economic fallout that occurred right at the beginning of Grover Cleveland's second non-consecutive term. So, yeah, I kind of feel bad for Grover Cleveland about that. But yeah, overall, that happened during his second non-consecutive term, so he was stuck doing that, pretty much dealing with the fallout of that economic slide. And I don't know. Cleveland's okay for me. I'm not particularly a big fan of Cleveland. I don't strongly dislike it either. I believe he was just okay. Okay, next we have Benjamin Harrison. Now, Benjamin Harrison I do not like. He spent a lot of money. I believe he started the $1 billion Congress, the first time our debt ever reached $1 billion. I believe that was during the presidency of Benjamin Harrison. And so all that spending happened, and additionally, the economy wasn't doing too well. So just pair that together. I'm not a big Benjamin Harrison fan. Benjamin Harrison was actually, I believe, the grandson of William Henry Harrison. So that's kind of cool. But yeah. Not a big Benjamin Harrison fan. I feel like a lot of his policies were unsuccessful and didn't really work out too well. He wasn't bad, but I would put him in the D tier, kind of like at the same level as Martin Van Buren or so. Okay, next we have William McKinley. Now, William McKinley I actually kind of like. Certainly has some negatives, but I'm actually going to put him in the B tier. Thing with William McKinley is I believe he really united the country. In the aftermath of the Civil War, after Abraham Lincoln was shot, we kind of got stuck with kind of these okay, not so great presidents, a lot of instability, and I believe William McKinley really was the president to bring the country together. Some would argue he was actually the first president to kind of break the isolationism of George Washington. And this, of course, was with the Spanish-American War. Now, do I think America should have gotten involved in the Spanish-American War? 100% not. There was no confirming evidence at the time and today that the Spanish sunk an American ship. But the newspapers advertised it like it happened. So I understand why the Spanish-American War happened. And there were a lot of positives to the Spanish-American War, like Cuban independence. A lot of people disliked American involvement in the Spanish-American War, though, because it started America's venture into imperialism. And William McKinley was specifically a very imperialistic president, which a lot of people ding him for that, and I get that, but keep in mind, every single country in the world during the time of William McKinley wanted to become an empire. So him gaining land in the Philippines and etc., I don't view that as too big of a negative thing as a lot of people do. I understand, like, the Philippine Civil War. I don't know if it's Civil War, but, like, independence wars were happening, and that was... our conduct in that conflict was not very good. But still, the things with William McKinley that I like, I was talking about a bit about his negatives, but he launched America onto the world stage first and foremost. And he united the country, I feel like, and brought about a strong economy. Economy was not doing too well, and then William McKinley became president, and it really started to recover, and it was really strong. I would say probably one of the strongest eras for the American economy. That extended through the presidency of William McKinley, Theodore Roosevelt, and William Howard Taft. So overall, I'm a pretty big McKinley fan. My negatives, though, is that he was very much pro-industrialist during his presidency. And all that. Oh, wait. Now that we're getting into that, I forgot to actually name, I think, a positive of Benjamin Harrison's presidency. He actually signed the Sherman Antitrust Act, which prevented monopolies. So actually, that's positive of Benjamin Harrison's presidency. Still doesn't save him from the D tier, however. Anyway, so William McKinley was more pro-industrialist, and that I'm not particularly a big fan of about William McKinley's presidency. So the negatives was the imperialism, as well as, and specifically what was going on in the Philippines, as well as, again, him supporting kind of those Rockefellers and all that, which was fine, but those companies were becoming way too big and way too powerful, I feel like. And so I feel like a reformer was necessary, and William McKinley really wasn't willing to be that. However, when McKinley was assassinated during his second term, a certain Theodore Roosevelt was willing to do some reforms. So obviously, this whole third party that I'm forming is named after Theodore Roosevelt's third party that he formed in 1912. So, as you could probably guess, we like Theodore Roosevelt a lot here. So, Theodore Roosevelt is going into the A tier. Great president. Now that we are getting to the more modern presidents, I could start talking a lot about foreign policy. Yeah. And so Theodore Roosevelt had a strong foreign policy. Of course, you've probably heard the term walk softly but carry a big stick. That was Theodore Roosevelt's foreign policy. And he really projected American strength across the globe. The theory that Theodore Roosevelt, I believed in was what is called realpolitik. And I believe that's the correct way to pronounce it. In which it was essentially every nation should pursue their self-interest, and in the end, everything will balance out. Which doesn't sound that good. You'd probably think that a more idealistic foreign policy about let's protect all the free nations of the world and yada, yada, yada is a better foreign policy. But whenever you become really idealistic in your foreign policy, we'll see this with Wilson, things do not turn out too well. That's, I believe, how we got involved in Vietnam, was we were just so idealistic that we failed to look at how much will the Vietnam War really benefit the Americas. And we got ourselves involved in a war that was very hard to win based off this ideal thing where, oh no, this country's being invaded, let's send troops to help them out. Which sounds like a good thing, but it turned into what the Vietnam War became, which was not specifically very good. So, Theodore Roosevelt, I mean, again, it's admirable about the Vietnam War, but again, I'll get into the Vietnam War when I get to Johnson and Nixon, don't worry. Anyways, back to what I was saying, if fully idealistic foreign policy does not work, and ultimately gets that country you practice it involved in so many different wars and all these different things. Again, I'm going to be talking about this when I get to Wilson, etc. But Theodore Roosevelt advocated for more of thinking about America's strategic interests. Through this foreign policy, we got the Panama Canal, which is a very important piece of infrastructure built by Americans. And it was a big thing that significantly contributed to American power. But you can see that actually this realpolitik thing that Theodore Roosevelt had worked pretty well. So for realpolitik to work, you need to have a blend of idealism. I'm not here to condemn a completely idealistic foreign policy. You need a bit of a mix between strategic and, seeing what is strategically beneficial for America, as well as having that idealism. You need to have the mix of both. If it's just one or the other, then it's not very good. You need to have that mix of idealism as well as looking out for the strategic interests of America. And Theodore Roosevelt, I believe, had this very well. He actually received the Nobel Peace Prize for his aid in negotiating in the Russo-Japanese War, just to show how effective that kind of mixing strategic concerns with idealism is. But yeah, his foreign policy was exceptionally strong. But not only that, his big thing was he took down all these big trusts like Standard Oil, which honestly were becoming way too powerful. So I'm glad Theodore Roosevelt did that. Of course, also another big thing Theodore Roosevelt did was he greatly expanded the national parks. Again, Ulysses S. Grant started it, but Theodore Roosevelt is kind of known as the national park president. He greatly expanded that and did a lot of great things. So I'm going to put Theodore Roosevelt in the A tier. Great president. And again, I like his foreign policies. Though I feel like it was a little bit interventionist within Central America to a fault. There is kind of that little tinge of negativity. Anyways, next we have William Howard Taft. So you'd expect me to strongly dislike William Howard Taft. After all, the Bull Moose Party, that third party founded by Theodore Roosevelt, was made in response to the fact that William Howard Taft was more conservative than he was progressive, at least according to Roosevelt. And so you'd think I would not like William Howard Taft because, again, the Bull Moose Party was founded in response to the deficiencies of William Howard Taft's presidency. But I actually strongly liked Taft. Just in normal life, he was a very nice guy. And he had a strong presidency. We had a strong economy. And I cannot think of one negative to say about William Howard Taft's presidency. I'm actually going to put him in the A tier. Here's the thing about William Howard Taft. He was idealistic in the fact that he did not want this great expansion of executive power. I like Roosevelt a lot, but that is one negative I have to say about Roosevelt was he kind of contributed more to that expansion of executive power. And Taft wanted to bring about a lot of reforms, I believe, just like Roosevelt, but he wanted to do it in a much more way that included Congress. And it was not just the president's, expanding his powers, doing all this stuff. He wanted Congress to help out. And I know it's not as much as quick results as, say, the executive doing it, but I feel like you need to have Congress to kind of keep things steady. So I like William Howard Taft a lot. I greatly admire what he was doing, in which he was trying to bring about reforms, but I can't remember, I don't know the correct word to use, but in just a more comfortable fashion, if you will. His foreign policy was not very good. That was dollar diplomacy. He essentially tried to give people money and hope they liked him kind of thing, and that was not very successful because a lot of those countries ended up going into debt to the Americans after we lended them so much money. And so that didn't work out too well, dollar diplomacy, but, he can't have a perfect presidency. Aside from that, though, he really just continued this era of America being very strong abroad and at home. So, yeah, I like Taft a lot, honestly. He's a very nice guy, and his time as Chief Justice is actually very good as well. Anyway, next we have old Woodrow Wilson. So we've had some consecutively good presidents here. We've had McKinley, we've had Roosevelt, we've had Taft, but now we're stuck with Woodrow Wilson. Now, I know a lot of people who study American history hate Woodrow Wilson for very good reason. He resegregated the American government. He contributed to the revival of the KKK, infamously screened a pro-KKK movie in the White House, which was not very good. And he also supported eugenics. So all of these things I strongly stand against, of course. And Woodrow Wilson, I just do not like. And those are big reasons to dislike him. But another reason I don't like Woodrow Wilson is his foreign policy. So say what you will about Woodrow Wilson, but for the rest of the presidents on this list, he significantly impacted their foreign policy outlook. He believed in complete idealism. He wanted America to only work with people they liked that were fellow democracies or whatever. He pretty much refused to work with anyone he felt was morally inferior to his ideals. This is taking idealism and foreign policy way too far. And again, now I was saying when you have too idealistic of a foreign policy, you end up getting involved in a lot of unidealistic wars, if you could say. So a great example of this is Mexico. Mexico is having a revolution. And Woodrow Wilson supported the revolution because, he wants to bring democracy. There was a dictator in charge, Porfirio Diaz. He wanted, more democratic thing. Anyways, he did not like how a certain Mexican president came to power after the revolution. So he started funding pretty much a terrorist called Pancho Villa to attack that person. And, yeah, because he did not morally agree with how this president came to power, he funded Pancho Villa, and Pancho Villa later on actually attacked American civilians. So that wasn't very good. Then to pair that with the fact that we actually almost went to war with Mexico, pretty much over this ideological thing that Wilson had where, he didn't like the way that Mexican president came to power, which that president did not come to power in a very moral way, I will have to say. But you still have to work with him. But Wilson he's too idealistic. He will not, really work with that. And we almost went to war with Mexico because of Woodrow Wilson's big idealism. Also, because of Woodrow Wilson's big idealism, we saw him interfere a lot in, Central America and stuff because, I don't agree with what they're doing, so I'm going to send American troops there, kind of thing. And, yeah. Ugh. And the big thing for me that I strongly dislike about Woodrow Wilson is he ran in his re-election campaign. His campaign slogan was "He kept us out of war." That was his campaign slogan because he kept us out of war in World War I. Okay. Then, not too long after, he got us involved in World War I. Some might say, that was justified American involvement in World War I later on in 1917. But was it? Was it really justified? Let's look at the two biggest reasons why America got involved in World War I. First one was the sinking of the RMS Lusitania. The RMS Lusitania was having, inside of it, British war supplies meant to be used against the Germans in World War I. The Germans sunk that ship, and yes, it did have Americans on board, which is not a good thing, of course. And I'm not saying Germany was right in having unrestricted submarine warfare along the English coast. But that ship was carrying war supplies meant to be used against the Germans. And their submarines sunk it. It's very sad when anyone dies, but Americans died, and I understand that. But, the Germans literally put ads in newspapers within America telling the Americans to not go on the British shores or on boats to the British shores. They were having unrestricted submarine warfare, whether you agree morally with that or not is different, but they told Americans not to go to ships going to the English coast. Some Americans did anyways on the Lusitania, and the ship sank, but it was carrying war supplies. That's the thing. But anyways, discounting that. The other reason we went to war with Germany in World War I was the outrage of the Zimmermann telegram, which is essentially a telegram sent to Mexico that said, if America joins the Allies in World War I, you guys join us, and we'll help you take back lands lost in the Mexican-American War. That was it. And while, again, you can morally disagree with the Zimmermann telegram, you can be outraged by it. I agree with that outrage. I think it was a stupid telegram to send, but does it really mean that America should get involved in World War I based off the moral outrage of a telegram and the sinking of a ship which had British war supplies on board in the first place? I don't think so. Wilson got us involved in World War I when I genuinely, personally feel like we should not have gotten involved in that war. We did not need to get involved in World War I, but I feel like Woodrow Wilson's idealism came in the way, and we got into World War I. And again, I'm not excusing the Germans. The Germans, again, the Zimmermann telegram was foreign policy stupidity, honestly. And then couple that with sinking the RMS Lusitania, which I do not agree with the German policy of using this absolute submarine warfare. I do not. But I'm just going to say, was that really enough reasons for America to get involved in World War I? I don't personally think so. So I'm going to put Woodrow Wilson in the F tier. Another thing, actually, I forgot to talk about this. After World War I, Woodrow Wilson again tried to push his idealism that, we need to form the League of Nations and stop all wars, which sounds good, but does it work in principle? No, it doesn't. And Wilson's 10 points ultimately failed, and the things that were enacted with the 10 points eventually just fell apart during World War II. So that didn't work out too well either, in my personal opinion. So yeah, I'm not a big fan of Woodrow Wilson. He did have significant impact on American presidencies in the future. I just don't like him that much. From his racial things to his support for eugenics to his support for this idealistic thing that I feel like almost got America involved in wars in Central America and also got America involved in World War One, which I feel like was completely unnecessary. Okay, after that rant, we have Warren G. Harding. Now, Warren G. Harding, I don't hate his presidency. Saw a lot of corruption involved, like the Teapot Dome scandal. But from my research, I do not believe he was actually personally involved in any of those scandals, like the Teapot Dome scandal, for example. Still, his presidency did have a lot of corruption, but he also brought about a strong economy. So that's the thing you kind of got to balance out for Harding, was he delivered a strong economy, and I believe was actually pretty popular, aside from all the corruption things that were going on. So I'm just going to put him in the C tier. I know a lot of people hate Harding. I don't think he's like F tier, though. Again, he delivered a strong economy. And again, there were all those corruption things like the Teapot Dome scandal. But other presidents had corruption in their administration, like Ulysses S. Grant. And I don't believe Harding was personally involved in those. Same thing for Grant. He just had bad friends. So, I'm going to put Harding in the C tier. Okay, next we have Calvin Coolidge. Now, Calvin Coolidge. I believe people of all ideological backgrounds love Calvin Coolidge. He was a nice guy personally and a fantastic president. We had a very strong economy during his presidency. And to boot with that, he was kind of, I talked about before, this idealistic thing where the executive branch should not be having so much power. Again, ever since Jackson, just the executive branch became more and more powerful. And Calvin Coolidge was one of those presidents who did not really want to push the power of the executive branch. And I really admire that about him. He was a strong, popular president that delivered a great economy. I like Coolidge a lot. Herbert Hoover, on the other hand, I do not like a lot. You could support tariffs or not support tariffs, but you do not put in tariffs when the Great Depression happened. Of course, Hoover was president when the Great Depression happened. He increased tariffs, Smoot-Hawley tariff, and I believe he also increased taxes, which is dumb during an economic depression. Also, his handling of the bonus army was not very good. So overall, Herbert Hoover was just not too effective as president. He was trying to do the right thing. He was trying, but it just failed completely on its face. So I'm going to put him in the F tier. Not Woodrow Wilson bad, but he's still not very good either. Okay, now I'm going to be talking probably for a little while about FDR. We're already an hour and 17 minutes into it, and I am going to talk a long time about FDR because there's a lot to say. To start it off, I do support a lot of what FDR did, like the Tennessee Valley Authority, giving people who are in rural areas where it was not financially viable for, say, a private company to provide electricity. FDR provided that electricity. And I feel like that's a big positive. I like the Tennessee Valley Authority a lot with what FDR did to it. And he also contributed to a great change in American foreign policy, where we started getting out of our isolationist kind of bin and out, working in the world. America's powerful now, and it should kind of work in world geopolitics. FDR kind of initiated that. Let's get to the negatives, though. So I said I like the Tennessee Valley Authority, but all of the government programs that FDR created in response to the Great Depression were pretty much almost all, except, again, with exceptions, were all ineffective and didn't work. If you just look at the raw data, FDR's policies did not help much of anything except increase the national debt. Okay? It was not very good, and it was not very helpful for the economy. Not a big FDR fan. when it comes to his handling of the Great Depression. I believe he possibly made it worse and made it last longer than it possibly could have been. But the real big reason I dislike FDR is foreign policy. FDR was, I think, a believer of that pure idealistic foreign policy. And this is another example of the weaknesses of that. So FDR was president during World War II. I don't believe his leadership in World War II was particularly indispensable. I believe had it been Hoover or anyone else, they would have responded in a very similar way to how FDR did. But FDR did hasten kind of America's move out of isolationism, which was a positive I mentioned earlier. But FDR, his handling of World War II, again, was nothing spectacular or anything. But the thing that really was negative was his handling of Yalta. That was a big foreign policy blunder. Winston Churchill had a plan to deal with Stalin, the USSR, to kind of make the Cold War not happen. They have a final settlement, and they each go their own respective ways. That was going to be the end of it. But FDR, during these negotiations, instead of siding with Winston Churchill, he decided to side with Stalin. Yeah. And it was all part of this idealistic thing that FDR had. That Stalin, he was not some mass murderer dictator. No, Stalin was a nice guy. FDR wanted what's called, I believe, the Four Policemen. America, United Kingdom, I believe France, and the USSR were essentially going to work together to bring stability across the whole world, and everyone would live happily ever after. Again, it sounds good. It sounds so good. But in the real world, it's not effective. Stalin was able to take advantage of FDR's idealism and FDR's belief that Stalin was actually a nice guy. He was actually a moderate. FDR, I believe, genuinely believed that Stalin was a moderate communist. That, all those deaths and all that stuff was just the extremists, and Stalin had his hands tied behind his back. But in real life, Stalin was actually a nice guy. Actually, I don't know if FDR believed this, but a lot of Americans believed that by the end of World War II, the Soviet Union was actually going to liberalize its economy and introduce more market things. And they also sincerely believed that Stalin was a moderate, that he was actually a Christian. He went to a seminary school, actually, Stalin, when he was younger, I believe. And so they thought he was actually a Christian. He was actually kind of more moderate on the Soviet bloc. That he wasn't some dictator out to try to conquer the world. But that might be an oversimplification on my part about Stalin wanting to be a dictator to conquer the world. If Stalin had the opportunity to conquer the world, I believe he sincerely would have done it. But I don't think that was his main goal. Anyway, I digress. FDR and a lot of the Americans had this idealistic view that Stalin was a moderate, etc. And Stalin took advantage of that, gobbled up a lot of Eastern Europe, didn't follow his part of the bargain at Yalta, because there was nothing to enforce those bargains at Yalta with. And so, yeah, we got ourselves stuck in the Cold War. I 100% blame a lot of that on FDR's leadership during Yalta. So, yeah, that's the flaws of being too idealistic, is you tend, not only will you get involved in a lot of wars, like what happened with Woodrow Wilson, is also you kind of get taken advantage of a lot as well. So I'm going to put FDR in the D tier. Again, he had some positives. Honestly, the Tennessee Valley Authority, I know I talk about that a lot. I strongly support the Tennessee Valley Authority. But again, other things that FDR did, I'm not as supportive of. And I feel like it just cost more spending. Oh, he started Social Security. That's a big positive. Anyways, aside from that, though, other things that FDR did, I'm not as particularly a big fan of. Okay, next we have Harry Truman. Now, Harry Truman, despite being the vice president of FDR, actually liked significantly better than FDR. Oh, wait. I'm sorry. I'm getting ahead of myself. Another negative of FDR's presidency was the internment of Japanese civilians. FDR kind of, and certain Americans thought that Japanese Americans within the U.S. might be spies for Japan during World War II, and FDR did this internment camp thing where he made Japanese American citizens go there, and that's not very good, of course. Anyways, moving on to FDR's successor, Harry Truman. Now, Harry Truman, I actually like him a lot. I'm going to put him in the A tier. Why? Why would I put Harry Truman, the vice president of FDR, in the A tier? Well, here's the thing. Harry Truman was not as much of a pushover as FDR when it came to dealing with the Soviet Union. He was kind of the first president to kind of realize the Soviet Union was not such a nice, moderate... Stalin wasn't such a nice, moderate guy. Additionally, at the beginning of his presidency, it was near the end of World War II, he was the president who actually initiated the nuclear bombings on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which I know a lot of people don't like, but I believe ultimately it was necessary. I mean, let's keep in mind, Japan didn't surrender after the first nuclear bomb. You had to wait till the second before they would actually surrender. Japan was going to do this whole big thing that would cost many American lives. You could see that in Okinawa. And so I completely understand why Harry Truman sent the bombs, and I believe it was probably the best of the bad decisions he had to make. I know, again, a lot of people would disagree with me, and I completely understand their argument. This whole list is my opinion. I mean, I didn't clarify that earlier. This is my opinion. I mean, this is not the end-all, be-all. A lot of people love FDR, and I completely understand why they would like FDR. There's a lot to like. But for me, his foreign policy and his handling the Great Depression, in my opinion, did not work out too well. But Harry Truman, I believe, in my opinion, he did the right thing with those bombings. But anyways, aside from that, Harry Truman had a strong policy when it came to the Soviet Union. He was pretty good. He got us involved in the Korean War, which kind of set a bad precedent that eventually we got involved in Vietnam, which Vietnam was not very strategically important. I believe Korea was more strategically important than Vietnam. And also, Korea showed that Americans were willing to stop Soviet aggression or communist expansion, which also was a positive. But again, I feel like people later on used that kind of same thought process to get involved in Vietnam, where it was not as strategically beneficial and caused a lot of bad things to happen. And his leadership during the Korean War, I'm not particularly a good fan of, because he didn't really set out a clear goal in the war. It was just whichever way the wind was blowing. When America was doing well, we're going to take all of Korea. But when America's not doing well, we're just going to hit the halfway point, I believe, was it the 38th parallel? I can't remember, but anyway, so yeah. But Harry Truman, I like a lot. Of course, he actually started the Marshall Plan, which gave a lot of funding to European countries after World War II and made Europe stronger against possible communist aggression, which, good for him. And also, I believe his presidency saw the birth of NATO, which is one of the most important military alliances of all time. So, thank you, Harry Truman. You did a great job. Okay, next. I'm getting tired. What time is it? It's 12:30. Ooh. Okay. Next we have Dwight D. Eisenhower. I'm going to try to speed up on this. So, Dwight D. Eisenhower. I love Dwight D. Eisenhower. He was an amazing president. He was kind of like James Monroe in the fact that he had a strong, stable America that was united. There was bipartisanship. It was a nice time to be alive. Dwight D. Eisenhower, great one. His foreign policy, I'm not as big of a fan of. His handling the Suez Crisis, I believe, could have been better. Not that he was morally right in what he did. I believe he kind of was. But he was morally condemning England and France about the Suez Canal crisis. And then, when the Soviet Union was... I'm going to give a breakdown for those of you who don't know. So the Suez Crisis was essentially Egypt was trying to take the Suez Canal from the British and the French, I believe. And so the British and French conspired together, sent troops, and tried to take the canal by force. Eisenhower did not support this. He viewed that as kind of imperialism, in which I completely understand and morally agree with. But here's the thing, at the same time, the Soviet Union was brutally crushing the Hungarian revolt that was happening against essentially communist rule, and Eisenhower didn't even really talk about that. And so that's kind of my thing. That was his big negative foreign policy-wise, in my opinion. But aside from that, pretty solid presidency overall. Again, just stability, peace, strong economy. He also was a dynamic Republican, I believe, what he called him, a dynamic conservative, in which he was willing to spend on infrastructure projects, which is a good thing. He worked on internal improvements. He made the interstate highway. So he had very big infrastructure projects that genuinely helped Americans. And also he enforced Brown v. Board of Education, I believe, which that was a very good thing as well in the civil rights area. He sent troops to guarantee that those African-American students in Little Rock were able to attend a school that was originally segregated. So good for Eisenhower. I like Eisenhower a lot. John F. Kennedy, I'm not as big a fan of, but let's be honest. He delivered a strong economy and a pretty solid time in America. Thing I don't like about John F. Kennedy, he was a little weak when it came to foreign policy, which I know sounds crazy. He was president during the the Cuban Missile Crisis, and he led us through that very well, I have to say. So he's going to be ranked higher because of that. But his handling of the Bay and Pigs invasion, as well as the Berlin crisis, was not, I believe, very strong. But anyways, so yeah, I'm going to put John F. Kennedy in the B tier. Strong economy. Everything was pretty good overall. I believe just earlier on in his presidency, he could have responded in a stronger manner to certain things that were happening. But again, his handling of the Cuban Missile Crisis was really good. Let me think. Again, there's no real negatives to say about John F. Kennedy. I feel like people overinflate John F. Kennedy, though. He was a good president, but he wasn't fantastic of a president. He was pretty good. Yeah, that's what I have to say about John F. Kennedy. I feel like a lot of people think he was a lot better than what he actually was because he was assassinated. And I feel like because of that, we tend to imagine in our mind that he would have been just this amazing president, especially when the next president after him was Johnson, who was not as particularly good as these previous three presidents. So I'm talking about Harry Truman, Dwight D. Eisenhower, John F. Kennedy. Anyways, so yeah, I'm going to put Kennedy in the B tier. I feel like his legacy is, I guess, a little inflated, but still, he was a strong president. Don't get me wrong. Okay, next we have Lyndon B. Johnson. Now, Lyndon B. Johnson, he has the positive of the Civil Rights Act and a lot of reforms that allowed African Americans to vote and not have to deal with all these literacy tests and all these things that they had to undergo that specifically targeted African Americans. So that's great with the Civil Rights Act and all of that. That's a huge positive. Keeps them from the F tier, I'll tell you that. I do not like Johnson very much. Objectively, the Civil Rights Act was great. But aside from that, just looking at this very objectively, I can't really think of any other major accomplishment. People point to the Great Society, but while the Great Society did contribute to unemployment, it also caused a lot of spending, which contributed to inflation. Pair that with Lyndon B. Johnson's handling of the Vietnam War. So Lyndon B. Johnson kind of escalated American involvement in the Vietnam War, and he did that because of the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which later on it was revealed that either he lied or he wasn't informed fully of the truth. I personally believe the former story. I kind of believe he lied about the Gulf of Tonkin incident, escalated the Vietnam War, and got us in a war that was very hard to get out of. It was a strategical blunder to get us involved in there. I don't believe America should have gotten involved in that, especially since North Vietnam wasn't even a democracy. It's not like we were defending, not North Vietnam, South Vietnam, a democracy from the communists. It was actually, I believe, sort of a dictatorship or monarchy, if you will. And again, I don't want communism to expand, of course, and I don't want South Vietnam to fall to the communists. But let's keep in mind that the situation in South Vietnam was untenable. And Johnson, when he did get involved in the Vietnam War, didn't behave the way he should in a guerrilla warfare and try to hold the strongest positions and eventually tire out the enemy, get them to lose all their supplies and end the war. That's how you should have responded to the Vietnam War. But Johnson, I believe, tried to cover all of South Vietnam, and you can't do that. You need to concentrate your forces in the area that really matter. He didn't do that, and that also hurt America greatly in the Vietnam War. So overall, I'm going to put him in the D tier. His lying about the Vietnam War, how we got escalated into that, along with several other things, plus the Great Society, all contributed to a great amount of inflation, wrecked the economy. So I'm not a big Lyndon B. Johnson fan. I mean, American stability by the end of his presidency was very, very poor. So I'm not a big Lyndon B. Johnson fan. But I am a big fan of Mr. Richard Nixon. Nixon, he's my second favorite president in the fact that, he's not the best president ever or anything, but he's my second favorite president, and I love studying about Richard Nixon. Again, he's not the second best president, he's my second favorite president. Objectively, that's probably Abraham Lincoln, but subjectively, I love Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon turned the tide of the Cold War. We were pretty much losing during the presidency of Lyndon B. Johnson, but he really turned things around. Firstly, he got us out of Vietnam. He did that through Peace with Honor initiatives, which allowed America to slowly withdraw from Vietnam, and he did that in a pretty effective manner, if not with a few hiccups along the way. A lot of people hate Nixon's Vietnam policy because of the bombing of Cambodia. But remember when I was talking about how you win guerrilla wars is essentially cutting off the supply lines to these guerrilla troops and then essentially starting them into submission? That's the only way we could have possibly won Vietnam. And the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese were getting supplies through Cambodia. They were using Cambodia, going in Cambodian territory to get all these supplies and then bring them in. We had no chance of winning the Vietnam War, or at least even getting an honorable withdrawal from Vietnam if we did not bomb Cambodia. Additionally, with that bombing of Cambodia, it showed to negotiations with the North Vietnamese that Nixon meant business. He was not going to just roll over. And that strongly helped, honestly, America get out of Vietnam and bring those troops back home. So I really like that about Nixon. Not the bombing of Cambodia, I get it, why a lot of people don't like it, because he was bombing a neutral country. But if we had any chance to get out of Vietnam in an honorable and peaceful way, we had to pretty much do that, I feel like, in my opinion. Again, I know there's a lot of different opinions on this. Vietnam is one of the most controversial issues in American history. And I completely understand all the different opinions on it, but still. I feel like also that a lot of that domestic people against Nixon about Vietnam War policy honestly hurt ending Vietnam more than actually helped in ending the Vietnam War. All those protests and things like that. Because the North Vietnamese saw that, if we just look how much dissension is in America. If we just hold out longer, the Americans are willing to give us more things in order to get out of Vietnam. So that also didn't help. And I feel like overall Nixon gave a strong leadership during Vietnam. Additionally, Nixon, was the president who did détente, which was a thawing of relations with the Soviet Union. He did a lot of strategic arms talks that limited Soviet strength, I feel like. But the big thing of Richard Nixon's presidency is his visit to China. When Nixon visited China, he upset the global dynamics of power forever. By visiting China and getting China as more of an ally to the U.S. than it was to the Soviet Union, despite China being communist, Nixon was pretty much able to win us the Cold War. Because now the Soviet Union had almost no options to go to. The strategy ever since Truman was essentially to strangle out the Soviet Union by letting it have basically no allies. The only allies it had was Eastern Europe, which they had to continually feed money to, because communist economies are not very sustainable, especially the ones that were in Eastern Europe. So with China gone, Soviet Union had not too many places to move. I read Henry Kissinger's book, Diplomacy. He pretty much discusses how in foreign policy, you're trying to remove the options of your opponent. And so, by taking China out of play for the Soviets, making it more pro-America, the Soviets had less places to move. In addition to that, Nixon's leadership in the Middle East significantly contributed to a collapse of Soviet influence in that region. Essentially, Nixon showed to countries in the Middle East that Soviet Union had minimal influence. For years, during the years of Eisenhower, a lot of countries like Egypt were toying with the idea of being more sympathetic to the communists, because when they were more sympathetic to the communists, America would send money to help Egypt and all those other countries reconsider. So obviously it was in their strategic best interest to kind of sympathize with the Soviets. They'd get American money, A, and B, they would get Soviet support as well, being kind of neutral. But Nixon was able to demonstrate that the Soviet Union had little influence. And so if you wanted to have an ally with influence, you better work with the United States. And I believe he did that with the Yom Kippur War, but I could be mistaken. So Nixon showed ultimately that America had much stronger involvement in the Middle East than the Soviet Union, and pretty much neutralized any Soviet, influence within that region. Nixon had a really strong foreign policy. Domestically, he was not as successful as the economy was still going hard with the inflation problem. To be fair to Nixon, though, the opposing party was in both the House and the Senate. So he couldn't really do much to, get rid of some of Johnson's Great Society programs, because we were funding Vietnam, and we were funding these Great Society programs made by Johnson, which created this inflationary nightmare. And I don't think Nixon was really able to fix that. But anyways, so economically not as successful, but I'm telling you, foreign policy-wise, Nixon turned the tide from losing under Johnson to winning under Nixon. 100%. You can't really convince me otherwise. Of course, actually, one thing I forgot to address was Watergate. That's kind of the big stain on Richard Nixon, was the Watergate scandal. And, yeah, I understand a lot of people dislike Nixon for that, but I feel like it's a little over-dramatized. I get it. It's a significant event. Nixon resigned from the office of the presidency of the United States and all that, and there definitely was corruption involved with Watergate, I believe. But my thing with that is, yes, that's true. Then you compare it to, Nixon visiting China, and I feel like it's nothing compared to the gravity of Nixon visiting China and all these other foreign policy achievements that he did. I'm telling you, Nixon did turn the tide to the Cold War. I sincerely believe that. And so, anyways, I know Watergate was bad, and that's honestly what kept Nixon from coming into A for me. Another thing about Nixon was he was by far one of the most intelligent presidents to ever assume the Oval Office. Some might say to a fault, but like, if you watch some of the videos made by the Richard Nixon Foundation of interviews with Nixon, I'm telling you, that dude is one of the smartest people I've ever had as president. So I like Nixon a lot foreign policy-wise. Domestically, not as much. And again, Watergate, obviously. Bold Moose Party does not want to emulate Watergate. I'm telling you, we don't. I do not. Yeah, it's a big stain on Richard Nixon's legacy. But if we're just judging Nixon by foreign policy, probably one of the best foreign policies of any president, period. Okay, anyways. Gerald Ford. Do not like Gerald Ford. Yeah, I'm not a big fan. He projected, honestly, weakness during the Cold War. I mean, during his debate with Jimmy Carter, he said there's, like, no Soviet domination of Eastern Europe, which, yes, there was. And that didn't play out very well for him electorally. But also, I feel like that hurt him foreign policy-wise as well. Domestically, there was a very bad economy, and Ford to not have a strong foreign policy kind of save him like Nixon did. There's bad inflation, and yeah, Ford just couldn't catch a break after he pardoned Nixon as well. So overall, I'm not a big Gerald Ford fan. He was like, So yeah, I'm going to put him in the D tier. Jimmy Carter, I'm going to put in the F tier. I'm tired, but I would love to launch into this whole big explanation of why I don't like Jimmy Carter. He just projected weakness. You could see that with his handling of the Iran hostage crisis. You could see that in just his foreign policy in general. He suffered from that ideological thing, which a lot of people, I believe, to take advantage of him. I mean, under his presidency, there was Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, again, the Iran hostage crisis, all these things. His one big crowning foreign policy achievement, people say, is his negotiations with Israel and Egypt. But even that was a result of Nixon's foreign policy of getting Egypt's dot to kind of see that America was the one with all the cards. They held more influence in the Middle East than the Soviet Union did. So that was all a result of Nixon. Okay, that wasn't Jimmy Carter, in my opinion. Yeah, his presidency had a poor economy and all that. I'm not a big Jimmy Carter fan. Additionally, gave away the Panama Canal for $1, which, come on. I mean, that was a very important piece of infrastructure. And I get the idealism behind it. I get it. I understand. I completely am fine. I mean, this is my opinion. I just feel like we're in the Cold War and you're giving away the Panama Canal, a very, very important piece of infrastructure. I know it's not as important maybe as it used to, but still a very, very important piece of infrastructure. I mean, I don't know. I just feel like that was, I'm not going to say stupidity, but not smart foreign policy. But yeah, Jimmy Carter's presidency, I feel like that projected weakness. America was not very stable during his presidency especially, so I'm not a big Jimmy Carter fan, personally. Now, Reagan. Reagan I like. I don't like him as much as Nixon. I'm just going to say that. His foreign policy was not... People give him credit for winning the Cold War. I'm just going to say I am 100% biased because I love to study about Richard Nixon, so I'm going to admit it. I'm biased, but Nixon had way stronger foreign policy than Reagan. I believe Nixon contributed more to the fall of the Soviet Union than Reagan did. I mean, again, a lot of people give him credit, and he definitely deserves some credit, for sure, but I don't believe he deserves a lot of the credit. Reagan actually had a very idealistic foreign policy. And he did almost give a lot of concessions to the Soviet Union in a lot of regards. So he was ultimately, though, a way better president than Jimmy Carter, provided a strong economy. I know a lot of people have their complaints about Reagan when it comes to the economy. I've seen certain arguments like it gutted the middle class or whatever. I am of the opposite opinion. I think it helped the middle class more. And I mean, again, there was a lot of economic prosperity Though there were definitely flaws with Reagan's presidency. I'm not going to say there weren't, because there was. Actually, the movie about Ronald Reagan, I know it was very pro-Ronald Reagan, but it was actually, I think, pretty solid overall. I thought it was a pretty good movie if you haven't seen that. I want to see the Nixon movie with, I can't remember the actor. They made a Nixon movie I kind of want to watch, but it's going to portray him as probably some, like, bad guy, which I feel like people overhate on Nixon. I know, again, Watergate, but I don't know. I feel like he's a little bit overhated, a little bit. But anyways, Reagan, his move is pretty good. Anyways, Reagan, I'm going to put in the B tier. I like him a lot. His foreign policy was solid. If not, it was okay. Of course, also his presidency suffered from the Iran-Contra scandal. So that also bogs him down a little bit. And again, the economy was strong during his presidency. But yeah, I'm going to put Reagan in the B tier. Because he was honestly, say what you will, just on a purely objective level, I feel like he was a solid, good president. Okay, next we have George Herbert Walker Bush. And I actually like the foreign policy achievements of George Herbert Walker Bush. The way he handled Desert Storm was fantastic. So that's a big positive, but unfortunately the economy wasn't doing too well under his presidency. Overall, I'm going to put him in the B tier. I feel like his handling of Desert Storm was great. The economy wasn't doing too well, but I feel like his handling of post-Cold War world and everything was really, honestly, quite solid. And the economy was doing bad, but I don't think it was doing awful. It wasn't, like, let's just say, second non-consecutive term of Cleveland bad, or Jimmy Carter level, or Gerald Ford, or even Nixon level bad. So, you know. Bill Clinton. Now, Bill Clinton I actually like pretty good as well. Definitely not perfect. He definitely had his fair share of scandals. But I'm going to put Clinton in the B tier. The economy was strong. We had our first budget surplus during his presidency. And so, yeah, I'm not going to talk too much about Clinton because, A, I'm tired. It's 1 o'clock in the morning. I am so tired. And also, Bill Clinton, he's more modern, and I don't want to get into too much detail on the modern ones because this is where things get a little controversial. But I don't have anything really bad to say about Clinton. He had strong economy, really strong economy. Could his foreign policy use a little bit of work? Maybe, but it wasn't necessarily a bad foreign policy by any means. So I'm going to put Clinton in the B tier. I feel like he was pretty solid. Not Thomas Jefferson level or James Madison or Millard Fillmore or McKinley. I would say he's on the same level as George Herbert Walker Bush, except for the exact opposite reasons. George Herbert Walker Bush is up there because he had a really strong foreign policy, I feel like, while Bill Clinton had a really, really strong economy. Not as much of foreign policy strength, but still solid. Okay, next we have George Bush. Now, I'm not a big fan of George Bush. George W. Bush. Yeah, I'm not a big fan. His handling of the Iraq War, I feel like, didn't turn out the way it was supposed to. And so, I'm not, again, a huge George W. Bush fan. I'm not going to give too much details because, again, this is more modern politics. And no, things get a lot more divisive when we're talking about modern politics. But I feel like his handling of the Iraq War didn't turn out too well. And plus, we had that 2008 crash during his presidency, which didn't go out too well. So I'm going to put Bush in the D tier because of those two things. He had some positives for sure. I believe his response initially to 9/11 was very strong, very good. But his handling of the Iraq War, along with, I'm sorry, I just blanked out. Along with the 2008 crash, left much to be desired, I feel like. Now, President Obama. I feel like the way he responded to the 2008 crash wasn't very effective, but it wasn't absolutely horrendous either. I'm going to put him in the C tier. Obama doesn't really offend me either way. I feel like his economic principles that he had were okay. I feel like he spent too much money, though. I do sincerely believe that on certain recovery efforts, and a lot of those recovery efforts didn't really work too well. But he was okay. Again, there were certainly positives and negatives to Obama's presidency. I'm just going to put him in the C tier because he really genuinely, either way, he doesn't really offend me. I have nothing. There's nothing like, oh, Obama's horrible because of this, or Obama was fantastic because of this. He was just, Okay, and that leaves us with the two most divisive presidents of the modern age, Donald Trump and Joe Biden. So, I was considering just not ranking these two presidents, but I feel like every time I watch a presidential tier ranking, I'm always disappointed because I won't cover these two, ever. And so I'm always, wish they'd rank it. But I also am running a third party. And one of the big draws to a third party is unity. We don't want all the divisiveness that's going around. So I thought a great way to bring unity and still not disappoint people on this tier list was to put both presidents in the S tier, just for fun. So yeah, I'm putting Donald Trump in the S tier. And Joe Biden in the S tier as well. Why? For the sake of unity. So yeah, putting those two in the S tier, just for fun. I don't actually think these two are both George Washington level, to George Washington level perfection. But again, just for fun, I'm going to put these two in the S tier. So, all right, that is my complete presidential tier ranking. Tell me what you think in the comments section below, and please consider subscribing and joining us, the Bull Moose Party, on our march to end the two-party system. Thank you so much for watching. I'm going to go to bed now. It is late, and I am tired. So, good night, everybody. Thank you so much for watching.